Good morning, my friends. This is the Batman GM, and it is truly morning here in the great Midwest. I'm currently parked at Yellowbank State Park. It's a small, very nice park. We've spent quite a bit of time here during the season when it's open. I have the luck of having one of the better spots since we can look out into the woods here without being interfered with. This is the installment of Airlords of the Ozarks. Kind of fitting, there were no wooded area to review this particular module for Twilight 2000. This is, as you may or may not be able to see, I purchased it for $7 back in 1987 when it first came out. And yes, this is original. You can actually see this one shares a little bit of wear. I think that stuck to one of the other modules when it was in storage. Binding's got a little bit of patina to it, so does the edges of it, but still serviceable. This one here, the slides of intelligence guys showing us had turned it's cold. The picture showed a main street of a small town, storefronts, post office, and a spire of a church. Caught my attention was the long, lean cigar shape hovering behind the church spire. Stories I'd read about a kid surfaced at the back of my mind. Stories of my Heinlein or Asimov and H.G. Wells. The shape was blurry enough that for one icy second I thought it might be. Then the next picture was a clear view. It wasn't an extraterrestrial spacecraft. In many ways, it was something far worse. That you can get the gist from the picture. It's a dirigible. So we got our contents, of course, and then the beginning introduction. I'm not going to read all that out to you. I actually think that's part of my intro or will be part of the intro for this installment, like I do with most of them. We have our adventure plot, the character background, how your characters get to the Ozarks, whether it's up from Texas, be way of Red Star, Lone Star, or by way of the Big Apple through Armies of the Night. Pretty much any one of these can lead to another module setting, although like I said in the previous video, there's actually a theme to some of these modules. It's just like in the earlier ones, you went from Warsaw to the Privacy of Isla, so on and so on. In this case, I did these things a little bit out of order. Probably if I had thought about it at the beginning of reviewing these things, I would have done them in as much in order as possible, because some of the orders kind of blur the lines, because you jump back and forth, and sometimes you're working for the military government, other times you're taking commissions from the civilian government, sometimes you're taking commissions from a third party, and that's assuming you're following the main gist of the modules themselves. In this particular case, it talks about the world, how things are going from worse to even worse. We're dealing more about New America. This one leads up to like kidnapped and Allegheny uprisings. So if it's right in those tracks, and the more information that your group uncovers about this New America movement, the more detailed things become. In this case, we're dealing with another cell, a very significant cell of New America, run by the number 2 man. It's played in continuing narrative unfolding through interactions between the players and the referee. Material in this book, blah blah blah. Can begin playing in Memphis, Tennessee, as described later in the module. Some referees may start in Jefferson City, Missouri. Players are working for the civilian government, or in Muskogee, Oklahoma. If they have completed an adventure campaign in Texas, either Red Star, Lone Star, or an adventure developed from that module. Blah blah blah. General encounters. Small game. Encountering dogs. Small game. Dangers of doing so. Large game. Abandoned vehicles. Things like this. The very sorts that you might expect to find in a post-apocalyptic survival scenario. And I'm using the term post-apocalyptic loosely because in theory that infers that the apocalypse has happened, whether it's recent or a considerable time ago. In technicality, the apocalypse is still in play. Granted, the nukes are no longer falling, biological chemical warfare is more or less to stop major conflict period between what was nations is no longer, in most parts of the world, is no longer a problem. It's this continued deterioration of the country, civilization, and environment. So we're still in that latter stages of the apocalypse, and it's not quite post yet. NPC experience levels. We're dealing with NPCs, rumors of intelligence, what's going on in Arkansas. Pretty much, they've acquired access to a pretty advanced, very large dirigible, lighter than air ship, and it crashed, but the survivors were captured by Numerica, which includes the engineers and many of the technicians that designed and built the prototype. The prototype itself cannot be repaired, but it was very, very big, and enough materials been salvaged from it to allow Numerica to construct two, and they're working on a third, smaller version, and which is kind of deceptive, because when I look at the video, it shows this implies this was one they can't, it wasn't function based on what's on the door, but you just have to take it with a tongue-in-cheek or a bit of salt. The referee's notes in an assignment in the country. Briefing. Preparations for the expedition. The goal says here, Major Walker has access to considerable stores of military equipment and supplies and will be able to resupply and equip the characters fairly well at their request. Available equipment will include the following: up to 3 Humvees, the military standard utility truck, either armed with a M2 or a Mark 19 auto grenade launcher, 1 or 2 5.25 ton trucks, M880s, medium-sized military trucks in common use that are unarmed, 1 FAB with an M60 or a tow. The supply of tow missiles will be sharply limited, rolling a D6, so potentially 1 to 6 missiles. Few personal weapons are available. Small quantity of ammunition for each. These include M6, the standard military style U.S. Weaponry that would be available. Then your generic things like binoculars, compasses, field packs, etc. New uniform, new BDUs, all that stuff would be available in quantity. The goal, of course, is to learn about the plans and organization of New America, an extreme right-wing dictatorship dedicated to building a powerful new state of the ashes of the United States. Large and powerful New America cell operating out of the Ozarks region. They want to find out who's got the blimps, what the heck they're doing with them, how can we get them away from them, and more importantly, capture any and all means of production for them, because if this would be a valuable tool to any resurging would-be government, regardless if it's remnants of the U.S. government or something new. And that goes without saying. He who controls the air controls the field, and that's quite viable. In the modern day situation, most of the advanced aircraft of our era are grounded, either from the lack of technicians and people to fly them and repair them. Most definitely, the lack of fuel. Fuel is a huge problem. Whereas you can convert ground vehicles to burn grain alcohol or methane, potentially even crudely create them to run off of steam. In the case of larger, trains and boats and things like that, you cannot do that with aircraft. Aircraft requires a very, very rich, fuel-rich supply of substance to run their motors. So without that, you're grounded. So if you have the means to create some form of air force, both for long distance supply and travel, and for local air control, it's invaluable. And included in this package is not just that the New America Cell has a number of dirigibles and the means to create more, but they also have acquired the foresight of this number 2 guy, acquired a sizable contingent of ultralights, which are one of the few motorized aircraft that you could potentially convert to run off of methane or alcohol. And in lieu of those, they would still run off of aviation gas, but they would be very efficient, so you would not need a huge supply to keep the fleet flying. in the interim anyway, with the idea, the long-term goals, eventually getting oil production restarted, and to get the means, such as refinery, to create more. To that end, it talks about further adventures in the Ozarks, possible characters' involvement responsible for breaking new American dominion over the area, and the American Cell organization remain ready for future confrontations. The Arkansas, Missouri as a whole is a singularly important strategic area. Wells in southern Arkansas at one time produced 21 million barrels of oil a year, resource which was carefully maintained and conserved in pre-war years, can be tapped again in the future. Strip mines in various parts of the states provide 90% of the United States bauxite ore, which aluminum is extracted. This will be a vital mineral for the country's economic industrial. And if the economy industrial is to recover, Arkansas is the only place in the country where diamonds have ever been commercially extracted. Now, now it's just a museum and a tourist attraction, but the possibility that you could reopen it and to extract limited quantities of very valuable resource, make it productive. That's why it shut down. It wasn't cost effective to compare to foreign sources for diamonds, and so on and so forth. It's a lot of good reasons. Of course, the adventure, ending the adventure, great air chase, foiling Operation Eagle Strike. That's another thing. In the process, your player characters uncover a plot by the New America Cell to use these dirigibles to launch a small supply of air-launched missiles. I don't have the acronym for them here handy. It's further in the back. We'll get to it. Here it is. Operation Eagle Strike. Deduced New America's plan to use the dirigibles to launch ALCMs against Memphis or some other target. If they penetrate the Ozarks and are captured and are imprisoned in a camp near Ponca, they're one of a number of set repairing the machines in a cave where you see the American technicians working on ALCMs. While these things are not nuclear tipped, you can pack enough conventional explosives in them to make them give a heck of a punch, and a few of these strategically launched at certain targets could be devastating to any resurging military or civilian government entity, and or strike terror into the population with the concept that somebody still has air power and the means to strike from a great distance, which gives them a lot of leverage. I want to take that away from them. You get your personalities: Private Dobson, Sergeant Redmond, Dr. John Carlin. In a nutshell, Sergeant Redmond was a lone scout who entered Newport, Arkansas, and managed to get away with the photographs. Okay, and we talk about that. So the major, or whomever, depending on what organization you get, your player characters get caught up in, gets approached by this individual who says, "We got a job for you." We sent an entire heavily armed scout platoon into the area, and it never came back. We sent a number of smaller squad-size recon units into the region, and they too never came back. We then sent some individuals capable and highly trained in backcountry operations into the region, and only one fellow will come back, and it's this guy. Just saying. This is kind of a repeated theme, because that happens in at least one other module too, where Armies of the Night, where they send literally battalions of people into New York, which just swallows them up, and there's no sign of what happened to them. After the 8th or 9th attempt at this, they turn to the player characters. By this time, the player characters have gained a reputation amongst the various military and civilian organizations that are aware and have limited communication abilities. They know these guys' skills and skill sets, and more importantly, their knack for surviving and actually accomplishing these very rough missions, and that's gained them some notoriety, which if savvy players could actually parlay that into a little better supply for their operations if they chose. Now I guess that would be player or GM discretion. We'll go into various NPCs, and as I point out, and I did notice this in earlier modules when I began, because I hadn't played Twilight 2000. Now that I'm running a play-by-mail or play-by-post, and I'm attempting to run one, the lack of stats for any of these NPCs is a bugger. That means you have to, as a GM, you have to fill in. You either have to have a generic cookie cutter template. Okay, this is the one I'm going to use for politicians. This is one I'm going to use for veteran military guys, and just overlay it under the bio. You have to create this stuff from scratch, which is it's just time consuming. And then there's no opposing forces. There's no preset version of the monster manual, if you will. I'm just pointing it out. There's just one of the downsides. It's just something I think if the game had continued and gained in popularity, it might have been addressed at some point. But I'm surprised it didn't. If it didn't get addressed, that people hadn't addressed or expressed their concerns for the lack of them at the time. But anyway, so we go into New America and we give it, and this is basically a different version of a couple of these that pop in different modules. So we have various backgrounds for New America, and they all look more or less the same thing, and gives you the information you need to operate them based on a module by module basis. Good girl. For a minute there I thought the fat cat was going to try to jump up on my laptop, which is perched over on the other seat, which is on top of my wife's purses and bags, because we just only have so much space in here. And I am dearly looking forward to the day we get a home and we get more room to spread out, because even my ability to, it just feels like I'm constrained. I've tried, to give myself more of a down view stuff, but it just doesn't seem to ever be quite enough. This thing needs more range. It's getting better. It's getting better, though. I'm not going to argue that. Philosophies, the hierarchy in New America, Rise New America, blah blah, Operation Valkyrie, now the dirigible attack. So, in part, early in the adventure, your player characters arrive in a small town in the region and arrive just in time for one of these aerial attacks to take place. And there's a pattern. The New America uses the dirigibles to bring in small amounts of ground forces and pre-position them outside the town, or they bring them in on foot. And then they coordinate the attack, and the ultralights and the dirigibles attack the town. Somebody with a bullhorn makes demands. If the demands are not immediately met, or the town doesn't capitulate, or worse, they open fire on the New America forces the attack's on. And it's more about striking terror than trying to utterly destroy potential resources. We want the milk, we don't want to kill the cow, kind of thing. And then in the confusion, the ground forces attack, and the air forces land some troops via rappelling down ropes, and it just adds to confusion because the town thinks that maybe the air attack is much bigger than it is, and so on and so forth. Then we talk about getting captured by New America. New America's philosophy is pretty not unlike the Nazi Party in some aspects, but there's some other twists to it. One being that if you're if you're of the lowest caste or the lowest class and or captured individuals, they use you as slave labor, and they'll work you to death, and they have no qualms about doing it. This is all about privilege and the right to who's got the right to be in charge, kind of thing. Keep in mind, please keep in mind, when we talk about that sort of thing, based on today's social movements to right the wrongs of hundreds of thousands of years of human history in a few days or months or decades, as it were. This was created in the 70s and 80s when our social dynamics were much different. And while we frowned on things like slavery, male domination was quite a common theme, and that men are always, especially white men, are always supposed to be at the top of the leadership role. Just saying not to take that as, take it with a grain of salt, right? Okay, so we got some special NPCs leading a popular uprising. Then we get into Operation Eagle Strike, engaging in large combat, which they tell you the Twilight 2000 just doesn't have any rules for that sort of thing. And if you really want to try to adjust this without, it's like I said, it's always going to be. I'm sitting here with my book at an angle now to make it look straight. Anyway, they don't have any rules really for large-scale combat. And that would be more like a tabletop war game. There are plenty of sources out there for that kind of rule set if you want to go there. And it says to refer to the Pirates of Vistula and the Ruins of Warsaw for additional information to help you along those lines. Operation Eagle Strike. They talk about where the captured missiles were captured, how they found them, what they're doing with them, etc., etc. Here's that dirigible, and like I said, they talk about they built these things from scratch, but I don't know. Perhaps that shouldn't have been on. The logo is questionable. Dirigibles and the general background on operating them, technology, the flight of the Cumberland. This was a very large cargo dirigible. It was being built in the 90s, and they actually built these things. They do exist. They've seen a resurgence of these things in like logging operations and a few other places, but there's no mass call for these slow-moving, lighter-than-air cargo vessels, which I have mixed opinions. I think they're cost-effective and maybe not for moving people around, but there's a lot of value for these things today, and the fact that we can put solar power arrays on them, and I think our government experiments with them more than they let on. But as of the 80s, these things were still in the idea of, well, let's bring these things back kind of state. So America's New Fleet talks about the various dirigibles that they have, the ultralights, and they've got two different kinds of ultralights, a Snoop and the Eagle Tube place, whatever those are, and I'm assuming those are real. That was another big fad that came out of the 80s, was these ultralights, and there's still people that fly them, and there's still a culture that deals with them. You just don't see as much of it in the news and in the media as you did back in the 80s. And we've seen them in movies, we've seen them in TV shows, we definitely see them in the news as people kill themselves. I actually knew an individual who, an elderly gentleman, a retired man of leisure, whose son owned a number of companies in the local area, and he dated my aunt for a while, and then he was a fan of the dirigibles, but he crashed and died in an accident with it. So, they have some disadvantages. They are ultralight for a reason. Then we got our operations map of the Ozark region, which is always nice. I like good maps. The lay of the land. Now we get into that section where we go from, this is the trip if you're taking from, say, Memphis to Little Rock, or rumor mill. Rumor C, I hear there's bad marauder problems out towards Jonesboro. Guess they shut down a lot of the roads out there. Rumor K, folks in Conway have been stockpiling food and survival stuff for years. Rumor P, funny things are happening in Little Rock. There's talk that the governor's being danced like a puppet on strings by somebody in the background. That's kind of amusing, because if you think about it, obviously the creators, when they wrote these, the writers, they chose to not use real world place names. So if you want to talk about who's being danced around, the governor of Arkansas in the 80s at that time could very well have been the future President Clinton. Just saying. If you wanted to intermix the real world, real people who was in charge at the time, and instead of the NPC types that they used, they could. Interrogation results. Result E, it is obvious from the character's description that New America is a large, well-planned, well-ordered, right-wing underground organization dedicated to taking over the United States. There are hidden cells throughout the country, well-stocked with arms and supplies. Goes without saying. Counter results. The city of Memphis. Counter results. Plots in Memphis. Notes on Memphis. Counter results. Plot in Little Rock. And then we get into the smaller cities and towns: Jonesboro, Bradley, Blytheville, Walnut Ridge, Newport. And our interstates, the major highways and roads: Interstate 40, Interstate 49, State Road 1. Towns along the highway, smaller towns, abandoned vehicles. Lay of the land part 2. This is where they get into other communities that are surrounding the area: Fort Smith, Conway, the Arkansas River to Buffalo. Additional rumor, and there's talk of a giant spaceship that crashed up in the mountains north of Buffalo. Army types were supposed to be dismantling it. They have bodies on ice. yeah, that wouldn't be the big original prototype that crashed, right? Conditions in Conway, attacking Conway. Now think about that for a second, okay? In this utterly confused state of this wanting apocalyptic world, verging on the post-apocalyptic, that anybody in uniform, in numbers, would be considered the Army types. So for a lot of locals, it doesn't. To them, they don't care who. If it's the civilian military, the civilian government, military government, New America, they don't care. These guys are all in matching uniforms and got matching gear or pretty close to it. They're not your ragtag bunch of marauders. They're going to be considered those Army types. Can lead to some more additional confusion when you're dealing with the rumors. Anyway, counter tales. Results: Lay of Land Part 3. This section covers Buffalo River Valley, land north of the Missouri border from Hardy to east Oklahoma, in the western area around Fayetteville, Rumor Mill, various communities of choice. Obviously, they don't include all the little burgs and towns and stuff that's on the map, because there's just not enough space in these modules for that, and not real need for it. You can easily pick up the Rand McNally maps or some other AAA maps that you can get them online for free. You use Google Earth nowadays and get quite a bit of detail for any given vicinity that you wanted to ad lib or add to the existing stuff. So Missouri in the Ozarks, Missouri Ozarks, New America in the Missouri, and there you have it. This is Twilight 2000 Airlords of the Ozarks. It is also at the current time the last of my collection. I do not think I have any more that I've found readily. There might be a possibility one or two maybe stashed away in one of the storage boxes in our storage locker, but most of my game stuff I put on the shelves so I could access them while they were in storage. Obviously the GDW, and since then GDW's other outfits have allowed and added additional stuff to the game itself over the years, and there's second edition, a third edition, I don't think a fourth edition. I don't recall hearing of that, but there might have been something. So there's other modules. I know I've seen them online, I've seen them for sale, I've seen them in hardback versions, and I've seen them for PDF versions. So you can continue to add to your collection if you want. And I've heard rumors of a few things that were added after by the player fans. After the company stopped producing these things, it becomes a little more easier to go fund your something and put something out there. Or if you're just a dedicated fan, you could create something of your own and just put it out there for free as a PDF. There you have it. Twilight 2000. I am going to be heading into my next set of reviews, which will be for my Judges Guild collection, what little of it I have that remains that I can find. So hopefully if you found this stuff interesting, you'll click on, you'll like it, and you will follow along and get on to the next great thing. Till next time, game on.